Hello everyone and welcome to this video. Today we will be going through an example GCSE composition to give you some insight into a typical composition process and hopefully to give you some ideas on what you can include in your own composition. For this video, we will be composing in Sibelius to a composition brief from the 2019 EDUCAS paper. The brief we will be using for this composition is compose a piece in rondo form for a showcase performance for young composers organised by the Sevenside Music Festival. The form we will be using for this piece has already been decided by the brief, so let us briefly recap on what a rondo form looks like. A basic rondo form uses A-B-A-C-A structure. This means there is a main theme, theme A, that repeats 3 times with a different contrasting theme in between each repeat. Variations on rondo form may use more complex arrangements, such as an A-B-A-C-A-B-A structure. However, for this composition, we are going to stick to the simple structure of rondo form. Next, I would like to decide the instrumentation for this ensemble. As this piece is being performed at a festival, I've decided to use a smaller chamber ensemble, as that is more likely to be available for this event. So I've decided I'm going to compose this piece for a saxophone quartet. So this will include soprano saxophone, alto saxophone, tenor saxophone, and baritone saxophone. As the saxophone quartet has a relatively modern sound, I've decided to embrace that energy and incorporate a syncopated rhythmic idea throughout. The rhythmic here resembles the clave rhythm which is used a lot in Cuban music. I want the melody I compose to reflect this inherent rhythm we've created, so I've composed this as my main theme. I've composed it in the key of B-flat minor in concert pitch, which means that saxophones in B-flat will be playing in C minor and saxophones in E-flat will be playing in G minor. Both of these keys are relatively simple and should be fairly straightforward for the players to play. You can see that I mostly stay around the tonic of the key and mostly explore the B-flat minor triad, firstly in a conjunct or stepwise manner, and then in a slightly more disjunct manner. Now we have all of these elements, let's construct the first A section. Let us start by putting the main melody in the soprano saxophone. To clearly state this theme, we are going to use a homophonic melody and accompaniment texture. For the chord sequence, I'm going to start with something simple, with a bit of basic stepwise movement. I'm going to go ahead and add the root of all of these chords into the baritone saxophone part, and let's also give them the clave rhythm to give this part a bit more interest. An effective way of expressing harmonic content while providing interest is to use arpeggiation. One way this was done in the classical period was to use an Alberti bass figure. We're going to use something similar here, but we're going to apply this principle to the clave rhythm we have already established. I'm going to put it in the alto and tenor saxophone lines, with the 2 parts swapping every 2 bars. This is to provide slightly more interesting parts for each player, and also to enable a bit more space to breathe, as it could potentially be a bit difficult to fit in a space to breathe in such figures. When either the alto or tenor is not playing arpeggiated quavers, I will have them double the baritone's clave rhythm, but either a fifth or an octave above, depending on what fits in the range of each instrument better. Add in some dynamics and phrasing, and there we have our first section. Now we can move on to the B section, our first contrasting section. It can sometimes be daunting at this stage to produce new contrasting material, and sometimes this can make you feel stuck. If you ever feel like this in a composition, it can be helpful to revisit some of the ideas of your initial theme and reuse them with a bit of alteration to construct your new ideas. Compare the initial theme with this contrasting theme I have just composed. You can see that the starting idea has been retained, but we have moved up to the median and thus into a major tonality. You can also see similarities between these parts of the melody. However, you can see that there are some significant differences between the two figures. The second is much longer, aided by repetition of certain elements, and overall it is much more florid with the insertion of this passage here. Now we have our melody, we can start to construct this section. To add a bit of contrast, I'm going to move the melody to the alto saxophone. I'd also like to keep a similar texture to section A, as even though we want contrast in the section, it can sometimes help to add a little bit of continuity, as this will help the sections to link together better and the piece as a whole to feel more cohesive. I want to keep the soprano saxophone free to do a bit more interesting stuff, so I'm going to limit the arpeggiation to the tenor part and keep the baritone part playing the syncopated root of our chord sequence. Our chord sequence is once again fairly simple, using 3 chords: D flat major, A flat major and B flat minor. However, I put some of these chords in their inversions to add a little bit more harmonic contrast. Furthermore, I've used the progression B flat minor to D flat major in this section, even though the melody would imply the inverse. I've done this to imply some slightly more interesting jazzier chords with the added and sixth respectively. As these chords share many of the same notes, they don't sound too jarring and fit in nicely with the rest of the section. Now for the soprano part. To create a bit of interest, you can incorporate some imitation of the melody to create a slightly more polyphonic texture. For the rest of this section, I've done a mixture of unison in octaves and hocketing, where I pass the melody between 2 parts. This makes this florid passage easier to play than simply putting it in one line. As there is quite a sizable jump between these 2 notes in the phrase, I've given the line to the alto sax, as I think this makes more sense texture-wise. Now for the addition of dynamics and articulation. I've decided to keep the overall shape of dynamic movement similar to section A, but at a louder dynamic overall. In the same vein, the articulation of this section is similarly legato. The repeat of an A section is usually very similar, if not identical, to its first instance. However, it can be exciting to incorporate a bit of variation here and there. For this first repeat, we're going to keep all of the key elements exactly the same, but we are going to add a little bit of variation to the main melody in the form of grace notes. However, all other features are going to stay the same. Now we can move on to section C. Once again, we can use the material we have already composed to construct a new melody. As the B section provided contrast by being more florid, I would like to do the opposite with this section and introduce more stasis. Therefore, this third theme is entirely constructed from just the opening figure of the original theme, using repetition and rhythmic variation using dotted rhythms. To further increase the stasis, I've decided to repeat this theme twice in this section. However, I've decided to move the melody to the baritone saxophone part for the second time, as this will provide a bit of contrast within the section. For the first statement of this new theme, I want to immediately alter the texture to something sparser and more tranquil. For these reasons, I've given simple semi-breves to the tenor and baritone saxophones. In order to achieve a slightly darker and more sombre tone, I've left the soprano saxophone empty for this moment. For the repeat of this theme, the texture is a bit busier, with quavers expressing the harmony in the alto and alternating between the soprano and tenor. The harmony for this section is also very static, moving simply between the submedian, G flat, and the leading tone, A flat. The transition from section B back into section A was pretty much instantaneous, so for the transition from section C into section A, I want to do something a bit more interesting. As this is our final instance of section A, I want to increase the anticipation and make it as big of a moment as possible. I also want to introduce a modulation in this section, as even though each section is focused on a different scale degree, D flat major in section B and G flat major in section C, the overall tonality has remained very close to the tonic B flat minor. Speaking of, section C ended in B flat minor, so I want to sit on this for a bit longer. I'm going to do this in a simple manner with this arpeggiation figure, but I'm going to introduce a bit of imitation in the alto part, as we have done before. I'm going to use diminution, a technique of rhythmic development where we reduce the note values of a figure to make this section increasingly frenetic. We will start by reducing the crotchets to triplet crotchets and then to quaver crotchets. At this point, I will then make the triplet quavers last for the duration of the bar, making a nice figure to introduce the modulatory passage. I'm going to use a very simple stepwise modulation leading down to F minor. And I want to have contrasting articulation in this section, so I'm going to make this passage staccato, which I think reflects the music I have written. Before we go back into section A, I want to stand on F minor for a bit longer to further assert it as the new key. This stepwise figure allows me to assert the new G natural, which helps to solidify the key. This also introduces a bit of dissonance with the supertonic against the tonic. I'm then going to move down a step to E flat major, but keep this stepwise motion in the alto part, as this will reintroduce the A theme in the new key. I'm also going to briefly change the meter to 5/4 for these couple of bars, which will further delay the section returning and give it a feeling of slowing down. For the final statement of the A section, we're going to do something a little bit more unconventional and alter the texture. I'm going to go ahead and move the melody to the tenor saxophone in its upper register. For this section, I'm going to give a sparser feel to add suspense, so we're going to reduce the baritone part to staccato quavers and add a little bit of variation to the rhythm. In the alto sax, I've partly retained the arpeggiated idea, but the clave rhythm has all but gone in favour of a more clearly common time pattern. I'm also going to add this trill-like figure into the soprano part. All of these features help to give this section a slightly more syncopated, unstable feeling, with lots of empty space to increase suspense. For this final A section, I'm actually going to repeat the A material twice. In its second iteration, we're going to return to the original texture, but still in the new key of F minor. This section ends with an F minor to E flat dominant 7 to F minor sequence. This chord sequence really solidifies that we've reached the ending of our piece. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been both interesting and useful for you, and I wish you the best of luck in your GCSE compositions. Bye for now.